If everybody can get seated, we'll get started here. What we'd like to discuss now is what the impact of the Bayh-Dole Act has been from a couple of different perspectives. And we're really honored to have John Hamre, who had the former Speaker of the House over at his place just a little bit ago and has to run back again, so we want to be conscious of his time. But John is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Strategic International Studies. If you know anything about DC, you've heard about CSIS. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense and was also the Undersecretary of Defense in charge of preparation, presentation, and execution of the defense budget and management improvement, which is no small thing. And he was also on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Kathy Koo, you just met as our Faces of American Innovation Award winner. She actually served as the Executive Director of Stanford University's Office of Technology Licensing for 27 years. And she now serves as the Chief Licensing Advisor in the Palo Alto office of Wilson Sonsini. And Brian O'Shaughnessy, you met, is the Chairman of the Board of the Bayh-Dole Coalition, and he's also chairs the IP Transaction Licensing Group at Dinsmore, a national full-service law firm, and he's also past president of the Licensing Executive Society of the U.S. and Canada, and leads its Public Policy Committee. So what I'd like to do is invite the three of you, from your perspective, what has the impact been of the Bayh-Dole Act? And John, if you don't mind, we'll ask you to go first.
I will. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for inviting me. I worked up on Capitol Hill when Bayh-Dole was passed, but I wasn't involved in it. I mean, it was in a different committee. I was on the Armed Services Committee staff. And frankly, I didn't pay attention. I didn't know. Thankfully, Joe was there, and he got it through. But since that time, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and learning. And so let me just give a bit of context here. You know, World War II was really a race between the United States and Great Britain against Germany and Japan on technology. It was really a competition who could get stuff out there. And Roosevelt was very wise to create a science research and development board. And the person that headed that was Vannevar Bush, who was the president of MIT. And it really created the institutions in the Defense Department that were so crucial during the Cold War. I mean, Lincoln Labs up at MIT, Draper Labs, Rand Corporation, MITRE, you know, institutions that really have carried technology as a foundation for national security. And the reason was we couldn't possibly compete against the Soviet Union in keeping a big army in the field, and we didn't want to. You know, our goal was to try to rebuild European economy and to rebuild our own economy, transfer it, and you know, the Soviet Union at that time was putting 15, 17, 18% of their GDP into defense. We weren't going to do that. So how are we going to match that formidable capability? We said it was going to be with advanced technology. So we were going to compete by having more sophisticated equipment in the field to offset the numerical advantage that the Russians had, the Soviet Union had. And that worked. It also created just a huge foundation of innovation in America. Now, you know, Vannevar Bush, when after the war, he started it while he was still, while the war was on, but he started working on a concept of what was called endless frontiers, science, the endless frontier. And this was to have a continuing refreshment based on the federal government supporting technology, you know, to both for national security and also for, you know, transforming the war economy. It wasn't very successful initially. It took over 5 years for the major recommendations that he had, largely creating the National Science Foundation, you know, to get going. And but it did happen, largely stimulated by the Cold War. It was a remarkable development. If you look at the last 70 years, it was the most glorious time in human history for the improvement of well-being in the world. 70 years ago, 85% of the world lived in abject poverty. It's only 7% now. I mean, and the world has grown dramatically, fivefold. So it's been astounding. And the United States was really instrumental in this. But you ask, why is innovation important now? Well, during the first years of the Cold War, the U.S. government was putting in the dominant share of R&D. Corporations hadn't yet generated the sophistication and the depth to do it, but the federal government was putting in 50, 60, 70% of R&D at that time. But it was dominated by Defense Department. Okay. And that just, I'm a defense guy, but, we don't tend to share anything with anybody, And when we started to see other departments, and we had things like the National Science Foundation, the question was, how do we get the innovation that's been created in a government laboratory available to the public? Now, that was what Bayh-Dole was doing. And as I said, I was a defense guy, and so I wasn't paying any attention at the time. But prior to Bayh-Dole, very, very little, hardly anything ever made it into commercialization because there were no structural incentives for it. And that's what shifted with Bayh-Dole. Now, government funding is probably only 20% of America's R&D spending. It's still highly focused, But what's evolved is the federal government will now fund research that's conceptual and not economic. The private sector isn't going to invest in the first time mapping the genome. It turned out that was actually done in a nuclear weapons lab. It was something that Pete Domenici wanted to have his nuclear weapons guys do something, at the end of the Cold War. And so, well, let's map out the genome. I'm not sure how all that happened, but that's what happened. Now, why is it important now? Well, national security, when I talk to people, there are two dimensions of national security. And I'll just make this mental characterization. Capital letter NS, national security, and small case NS. Small case NS, national security, that's aircraft carriers and bombers and tanks and divisions and aircraft pilots, etc. That's small case national security. Capital N, capital S, is the strength of your economy. It's the creativity of your ideas industry. It's the innovation policy of your society that stimulates that, the government incentives to stimulate it. It's the regulatory and legal system that ensures fairness. Patents, for example. That's capital letter national security. And we're now entering an era that is profoundly different than the Cold War. Where this is the sixth epoch of America's foreign policy. The fifth was the Cold War. This epoch is a giant technology and economic competition with China. We've got a big department over there across the river that's going to take care of a war if we have to do that. But we don't have any focal point in the federal government for putting together a national economic strategy to succeed. So part of what I'm working on is that, and I'm excited by that as an idea. But when you get down to it, the government's role is to ensure that incentives are in place for innovation. And in our society, you do good and you do well, but I want people to do well, but we have to give them the chance to do good. And that's one of the foundation points for that is the incentives to make profit. And that's really been the core of Bayh-Dole. So from my standpoint, if we're going to win this big new era of competition with China, it's going to be that we have to prevail in being more innovative, more creative, and at a faster pace. And that means harnessing together the public and the private sector in constructive ways. And Bayh-Dole did that. And I look at it today, it's just as good today as it was 40 years ago. It's been under attack for kind of, I think secondary issues. I mean, but it's been under attack. It's not unlike the original battle that you guys faced, because at that time there was a battle with, well, is this the government's property and therefore should it be available to everybody, or should we let somebody make a profit off of it? And you found a formula for that. That formula is still valid, and it's one that's more important now because, in the DoD world, my old world, we got these laboratories, but it takes 25 years to get something out of them and put it into the field. The private sector is inventing stuff at 5x compared to our speed. And if all of a sudden that becomes less available, it's going to hurt us. So at both capital level, capital letter NS and small case NS, it's really important to sustain a dynamic innovation foundation in this country, and Bayh-Dole is central to that. Yeah.
My boss at Stanford would say all these inventions lie fallow in the journals. Nobody knew about them. They were published, inventions were published or research results, and very few people even knew about them. And so, it was really hard to get patents. There were a few universities that, pre-Bayh-Dole, could get permission from different agencies, the NIH or the NSF, to handle the inventions. But you ordinarily had to go to each agency if you wanted to handle inventions, and most of the time all the other agencies said no. So the government wanted to handle these inventions. They filed on patents, they sat there in the patent office and nobody took them. So there were a few universities, as I said earlier, that were interested in licensing. And so we get these patent agreements in place. But again, without an incentive for the universities to do this, it's hard to set up an office. It costs money to bring in staff, to train people, and then filing patents are really expensive. Again, at Stanford, we spent, $14, $15 million a year on patents. And then you had to have the staff. So nowadays, the inventions are brought to industry's attention. All the universities have some sort of marketing thing where you send out an invention and you say, this looks pretty good. Your company might be interested in it. It should do something better, something cheaper, something more effectively, cure cancer, help diagnose some disease. And again, the reality is most companies are not interested. It's not quite in their bailiwick. So again, this is a hard job. I think that much of the answers, the universities now feel like the startups are often the route. And I think that's a good way to move because, again, with these passion of the inventors, they're the ones who really want to make it work. Now, of course, they have to find investors, they have to scale up, they have to make a product that's going to sell at a price that somebody will buy. It's a long road, and it's definitely not, there's no guarantee that you'll succeed. Many companies don't succeed. But we have to give these entities a chance to try. And then again, at least in Silicon Valley, you can try, and if you fail, try again. It's not a big deal. You just keep reiterating and trying to, make something happen. I really think that the universities have gotten very sophisticated. They mostly know what they're doing. They know how to interact with industry, and as we said earlier, if you have a good relationship with a company, they'll come back and get more technologies, and that's what you want to happen, that this is a repeat customer kind of situation. And then if they start working with university faculty at one level, they'll work with them at another level. They'll do sponsored research, they'll help support students, and this private-public interface is really important to foster. And the last thing I want to say is that once we create sort of an entrepreneurial ecosystem or environment, you're helping the next generation too. So it's a generational ethos that you're promoting, and I think this is really, again, good for America. So Bayh-Dole enables all of this. It's not stated in the law, but it's the perhaps unintended consequence of such a really good, inspired piece of legislation.
Thank you. Brian?
Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks, John and Kathy. I'll piggyback off of some of what John said because, of course, he focused on Dr. Bush's epistle, if you will, the Science, the Endless Frontier. And I discovered that probably a decade or so ago, and I thought, wow, somebody actually wrote all this stuff down. It's just a brilliant piece about how science is the endless frontier, and it has the potential to improve global health and well-being. And in addition to that, the National Science Foundation, I think, published a 25th anniversary or 50th anniversary of the report, along with President Roosevelt's letter commissioning the report. And you see in President Roosevelt's letter, I thought, incredible eloquence and prescience in terms of what America was faced with. And the basis, if you will, for President Roosevelt's commission was we got all this incredible technology as a result of World War II. The war effort required us to focus on a certain number of things and skills and talents and products, and we did that, and we did that to enormous benefit to all of society. So remember, at the beginning of World War II, nobody knew what radar was. Nobody knew what antibiotics were. And then, of course, there's atomic energy. All of that came to light and came to application by necessity as a result of World War II. So the Brits, for example, had no idea how the Germans knew where their planes were. And so the Brits were confined to, binoculars to find out when the Germans were coming over. So the Germans were bombing at night, and the Brits were bombing during the day because the Brits didn't know about radar. The Germans had. It's an incredible story, and I think, Roosevelt was brilliant in the sense of saying, how do we keep this momentum going? And so he commissioned Dr. Bush to do this study and prepare a report, and it really laid the groundwork for Bayh-Dole. And I think in many respects what it did is it drew a big distinction between applied research and basic research. And Dr. Bush spoke very eloquently as well about, basic research is the function of government. We can't expect industry to invest in basic research because there is what they call the piggyback effect, if you will. When you do basic research, you don't know how it's going to be applied, so you may be giving your competitors incredible resources in terms of developing products that then they can use against you. And it's hard to justify to your board and to your shareholders why you're investing in basic research because you don't know how it's going to be applied. And so therefore, the shareholder value is rather questionable. And so Dr. Bush says, basic research is the function of the government just as it is to build airports, rail systems, and highways. And then it is the business of business to take that applied research and turn it into something useful for humanity. And he sort of laid that out, but not obviously in the detail of the Bayh-Dole Act, but it certainly paved the way for the Bayh-Dole Act. And so the public-private partnerships that the Bayh-Dole Act has enabled, that Kathy spoke so well of, was enabled initially by President Roosevelt, Dr. Bush, and then ultimately the Bayh-Dole Act. And obviously it's been enormously successful. You heard me talk about the virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle is important just because it provides income for faculty that they might not otherwise see, but it enables them to fund their labs, and it enables them to pay their graduate students. And as Dr. Chaudhuri said, You know, this sort of stuff doesn't just come out of thin air. We have to pave the foundations by educating our workforce. And we educate our workforce by providing the finest highest higher education system in the world. And we do that largely because the federal government funds a great deal of research, but the private sector funds a great deal of research. And the private sector wouldn't fund that research in the form of sponsored research unless they knew that there was a reliable avenue for the intellectual property that comes out of that funded research to flow back into their portfolio. And so now we have this incredibly vibrant public-private partnership. I'm not very good with alliteration. Whereby, you know, private funds flow into the universities fund labs, they fund graduate students, and they fund faculty. And this all produces things that then get licensed out, which produces more revenue for the university. And then the private sector spends the 10 years oftentimes developing it and turning it into useful products. And I can tell you that in addition to the work that I do for Dinsmore and for LES, I'm also on the board of my alma mater, Rochester Institute of Technology. And we look at, you know, how does the university sustain itself? And public-private partnerships are an incredibly important part of how a university continues to keep the lights on, keep the faculty in academia, and to keep the graduate students coming through so that we have tomorrow's principal investigators and we continue the cycle over and over again. So, you know, without Bayh-Dole, that vehicle for funding, that vehicle for interaction with industry guiding academia in terms of where the problems need to be solved and the role that academia can play in that has been incredibly valuable. And as we saw today from our awardees, it has been enormously successful, productive, and efficient in terms of improving the well-being of all of humanity. So, you know, I just can't say enough about the virtuous cycle that Bayh-Dole has created. And, you know, to hear folks attacking Bayh-Dole, it's just so evident that they just don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand how the cycle of innovation actually happens. They don't understand the complexity, and they certainly don't understand the timeline. So, again, kudos to you, Joe, for telling the story, getting the attention of media, and really making for a more balanced public debate. Certainly we should be looking at these things. We should be making sure that the American taxpayers' money is being used responsibly and effectively. But I think the Bayh-Dole Act has done that. Obviously, there's always a few tinkerings around the edge that we can do. But it truly has been a remarkable success, and we all owe a debt of gratitude to Senators Bayh and Dole.
You know, DOD, I can only speak for DOD, but I mean, we've got 150 laboratories, and virtually nothing gets commercialized. Why? Well, the law of the land says that any commercial benefit, any income that comes from an invention the government created, the money goes to the Treasury Department, not to the laboratory. Now, there are two ways around that. One is Bayh-Dole, and the other is what's called a cooperative research and development agreement. You know, a CRADA, it just takes a lot of time to work through, and you know, lab directors, the civilian lab directors are going to say, geez, what pain in the butt to go through all of that, and why bother? And we may not get any money anyway. And the other problem is very, very, very few civil servants now have any experience in the private sector. So they tend to way overestimate the invention that came from their idea and way underestimate what it costs to make it into a product. They don't, you know, so when they think, well, this has got to be worth tens of millions of dollars, and then and you got the same thing here, Kathy, but we're tens of millions of dollars, and then they talk to somebody and say, well, we'll give you 55,000 for it, and then maybe 2%, royalty or something. I mean, what is it? It's not worth my effort. So the thing is about CRADAs is the burden is on the government to go through and figure out, is it worthwhile? The advantage of Bayh-Dole is the incentive is with the guy that's invented the idea. And so this is a structural problem with the federal government. This is why so little of the original innovation ever ended up in the marketplace, because there were no incentives for people to do it. We said, screw it, I'll never get the money anyway.
I agree with John, 100%. Most of the inventions that I've run into, as we said, they're very, very early stage. You need to give some exclusive license to some companies so they have a little bit of an advantage so they can possibly make a profit. And the federal system prefers that they grant non-exclusive licenses. And non-exclusive licenses where it gives access to everyone is honestly a little bit of a tax. You cross over my bridge, you pay the toll. That's what ordinarily a non-exclusive license is. So you need to give an incentive for a company to take a license. And so the system, the federal government tech transfer system is really rough on entrepreneurs and companies.
The essence of Bayh-Dole is the government should fund the research, have a couple simple rules, which everyone's understood for 45 years, and then get out of the way. Bayh-Dole decentralized ownership to the inventing organizations, which are universities and small companies, because we thought those are the people making the invention. They know the most about it. They know what the rigors of commercialization require. But there are people working 24/7 up on that white building on top of the hill. They actually want to roll this back. They've never gone away. They're basically the same people we fought in 1980. So let's suppose for a second they actually succeed in having the government impose price controls on things that are commercialized, or put the government system back in place again like it was before 1980, where they're micromanaging and second-guessing you. What would be the implications of that for our economy and our national security?
I think it would be disastrous. We have the best university tech transfer model in the world right now. And we have a system that the rest of the world really admires. And I feel like when something works, don't mess with it. There's no reason to mess with it. I think I've often said for price controls, university tech transfer is not the problem. We're also not the solution. If you want to do price control, figure out where the problem really is. If you ruin this innovation pipeline, if you prevent people from even wanting to take these early stage, high risk inventions to the marketplace, then nothing is ever going to happen. So once the product gets to the marketplace, if there's some reason that you feel the government feels like it needs to do price control, figure it out then. But don't stop the whole process because you're worried the price ultimately will be too high or not.
Brian or John, you have any thoughts?
No, I think from national security small n, small s, if Bayh-Dole were repealed, it wouldn't have a big impact. And the reason is that, weapons acquisition is so constrained in ways. So few people are involved. They're big companies and government laboratories. You have to have a clearance and all that kind of jazz. That the innovation part of it is not a dominant factor. It was 40 years ago, but I would bet that most of the chips that are in weapon systems today couldn't power a laptop. They're old stuff, purpose-built old stuff, So the real issue for DoD is different, and that is how do we overcome the dominance of this culture of requirements-driven and buy off-the-shelf stuff? That's the real challenge for us in DoD. Small n, small s. Capital N, capital S is very different. And, it's the foundation, it's one of the foundation stones of innovation. The patent system is one. The science instruments like the National Science Foundation is another. Bayh-Dole is another. It's one of the foundation stones. And so if we're in a giant competition with China, we are, and it is about technology, why would we pull out one of the foundation stones? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And but the people who are doing this have an exogenous ideological agenda that's about drug prices and should the government be the single payer for medicine and all that. I think that's really what's going on here. But they've drug in drug prices as just part of the battle because it's easy to make people pissed off, when you talk about high prices of drugs. But the foundation, the problem is they don't care about the foundation stone. They're just trying to win a tactical battle. And I think that's the real dilemma here.
Joe, if I put my lawyer hat on for a minute, I would say that if somebody came to me and they were looking to invest in university research and were thinking about taking a license, and the NIST guidelines recommending price as a factor in terms of using March-in were actually formalized and implemented, and March-in actually became a tool that the government was using, as Kathy said, it would be disastrous. But speaking as an advisor to industry, one of the things industry has to do, and it does exceedingly well because the market forces them to do that, is to calculate risk and to weigh risk in the value of a product. And if you have March-in as part of the calculus, well, the risk that that asset isn't going to pay off explodes exponentially. And so now, all of a sudden, your university-based research is not worth a fraction of what it was yesterday because I don't know when, why, or how the federal government is going to march in on my otherwise responsibly negotiated exclusive license. And in fact, no university can really grant an exclusive license anymore, if that were the case, simply because they can't guarantee that the federal government isn't going to march in and take that exclusive license away and give it to somebody else. And so this would be devastating to our higher education system. It would be devastating to the public-private partnerships. Far fewer industry would be willing to partner with universities. And universities really are the collection of higher wisdom. And it is a collective organization where ideas do flow fairly freely. And the alternative is going to be that we'll go back to the siloed structure where industry has highly isolated research centers where each company is working on its own little thing and they don't get the benefit of the greatest minds in America in the academic world. They'll instead go back to the not invented here mentality, and ideas won't be widely shared. But most importantly, as I say, the higher education system of America will suffer dramatically. We won't produce as good scientists. We won't produce as many graduate students who then go on to become principal investigators or often go into industry themselves. And so the pipeline, if you will, of intellect, and I shouldn't gloss over the fact that still America's universities are the destination for the world. So we have a net inflow of intellectual capital that comes to America. So the best and brightest minds come to America because Bayh-Dole makes it possible through the public-private partnerships. And so that net gain, if you will, of intellectual capital is going to be severely diminished. The funding and the industry interaction with academia is going to be diminished. The number of principal investigators is going to be diminished, and the number of graduate students is going to be diminished. So, it's a snowball effect, and people don't, I think, again, this is sort of a hallmark of the lack of technological savvy, knowledge, and competence amongst our policymakers and our legislators. So just as John said, so many people today who are bureaucrats don't know anything about private industry. Likewise, we have a lot of legislators and staffers and policymakers who don't know anything about science. They don't know how science evolves from the lab to the marketplace. Very, very complicated process, time-consuming, and very, very expensive. And Bayh-Dole makes that gamble that much more appealing, and therefore more and more companies are willing to take that risk.
So if you had one succinct piece of advice to give to lawmakers and policymakers in this town, what would it be?
I would ask them to reflect on the fundamental issue, and that is innovation in America the sole responsibility of government, or is it a shared burden with the government and the private sector? If you're going to take out the profit-making incentive from innovation, it's going to be just in the government. That was the debate we had 40 years ago. Who owns this? Is it the people that own it, we the people, or is it the inventor, and can he do something with it? It's a fundamental philosophy issue about how do we structure progress in American society. And Bayh-Dole got it right. That's because they put a Democrat and a Republican, a liberal and a conservative together to figure it out. And it worked. So just go back to fundamentals. Think about what is the fundamental question that's the best thing for our success over the long time as a country. That's what I would ask him to do.
Don't mess with Bayh-Dole. It's worked. It's been proven to work. Keep it going. And then the second piece, and I don't know whether you all have done this, but read the Better World Project's reports that Autumn puts out, because these stories, like all the stories we've heard this morning, they're wonderful. And it just shows how universities have been able to move these early stage technologies out into the public for the good of the world.
I guess I would say the only thing that has been more effective at promoting innovation and increasing societal well-being, other than the patent system itself, is the free market. And the free market has created, as John mentioned, enormous wealth and the improved quality of life for people all over the world. And the beauty of the Bayh-Dole Act is that it puts those two things together. It allows universities and small companies who benefit from federal funding to take advantage of the patent system and use it to its intended purpose, to promote the progress of the useful arts and to get ideas out of concept and into application so that everybody can benefit from it. And the free market obviously makes sure that that is done efficiently. It's not flawless, but we haven't invented a better system yet. And so we need to keep that pairing together of the free market and the patent system. And so then I would echo Kathy's sentiment, which is don't mess with the success. The Bayh-Dole Act has been enormously successful. And so don't succumb to simplistic arguments.
Well, listen, let's thank you, the panel. You guys have did a great job.